This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. Carius meets Himmler in 1944. Let's begin. The time finally arrived that I was supposed to report to Heinrich Himmler. The major re-emphasized to me that I shouldn't mince words. Himmler liked it when someone openly expressed his opinion. I was supposed to do just that during our conversation. The staff headquarters was in a villa where Himmler lived as long as the train wasn't going somewhere. I had to check my briefcase at the entrance cottage. Nobody asked me for my pistol. Before I was admitted, an SS officer briefed me one more time. Himmler was addressed, as I already knew, simply as Reichsfuhrer, and not as Herr Reichsfuhrer. Furthermore, my hat had to be tucked under my arm before I entered. That was in contrast to the Wehrmacht, where we reported to our superiors under cover. Everything was understood, and we could start. I had no illusions after everything I had heard about Himmler. It didn't help that we didn't have any great love of the SS either. I reported succinctly, Oberleutnant Carius, commander of the 2nd Company of the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, reports as ordered, following convalescence. It did cost me some effort, however, to leave out the customary respectfully reports. I also had to make an effort not to address him in the third person, but rather just use the word you. Once in a while, the power of convention scored a victory, especially during the conversation after the meal. But I didn't lose my head because of it, or because I asked everything that was on my mind. Himmler had stood up. In the name of the Führer, I am presenting you the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, which were awarded on July 27, 1944. The Führer extends an apology because up to now he has always personally presented the award. The Führer is overburdened. He has empowered me as the Chief of Staff of the Replacement Army to present the oak leaves to you and to extend his best wishes for a speedy and complete recovery of your health. I personally congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. You can certainly be proud because you are the youngest bearer of this award in the entire army. Himmler approached me, shook my hand, and gave me the oak leaves in a case. He then said in a friendly manner, "We'll now want to go over to dinner. The guests are probably already waiting. We will be able to converse in private after dinner." After a short, military thank you, I put the little box into my breast pocket and went into the anteroom. Himmler was already next to me, however, and said, "My dear Carius, that simply won't be allowed. I'm going to introduce you shortly as freshly decorated after all. You are going to have that thing around your neck for better or for worse." He removed the paper clip, which held the Knight's Cross securely on the ribbon, and added the oak leaves. He then tapped me on the chest and said, "That's probably your own invention. I will recommend it to my men. Some of them are also wearers of that kind of necktie." He was talking about the elastic band from the driving glasses. It could be placed comfortably around the neck, regardless of neck size. This manner of wearing it was especially practical with shirts. My first impressions of this man, whom his opponents called a bloodhound, had really pleasantly surprised me. I wasn't apprehensive about the upcoming cozy conversation anymore. Himmler and I went to the dining room where approximately 15 to 20 men rose from their places. I was introduced to the entire group and was given the seat to the right of Himmler. I was soon able to determine that the majority present were generals, together with a few men in civilian clothing. The conversations were extremely interesting for me. 2 SS generals had been ordered back from Yugoslavia to discuss the additional measures that were intended to be undertaken there. It should be noted that the partisans were at odds with one another. The old animosity between the Serbians and the Croatians continued to exist and had been exploited by our leadership for a long time. We thus supplied the Croatians with weapons. We now wanted to recruit them and use them for ourselves. A few of the civilians were from the armaments industry. According to them, the main problem that had to be solved soon and under all circumstances was air defense. Of course, that was also clear to any layman who had viewed and been horrified at the devastation of our cities. I would have been only too happy to discuss that topic even longer with those men, especially since this was the only place where I could have discovered whether there still could have been the chance of a successful conclusion to the war. The meal was appropriately simple given the times. There was soup, followed by meatballs, vegetables, and potatoes. It should be noted that in honor of the guest, the potatoes were peeled and not in their jackets. Finishing up were preserved pears. At any rate, it was certainly no luxurious meal. When I was finished with the first serving, I naturally wanted to stop. Himmler gestured to the orderlies, who were all SS Scharführer, and personally put some more on my plate. He was in a good mood and said, "Eat up, Carius. You don't look as though you need to hold back. On the contrary, you ought to gain some weight. Otherwise, a quick release from the hospital is not at all conceivable." To the laughter of all assembled, he pointed to a general who had already put on a little fat. "Carius, you have to put on at least half of that weight." Himmler had on a simple field gray uniform. He didn't wear any type of piping or decorations. It amazed me that this man was supposed to be so dangerous. I thought that probably anyone who has to ensure order behind the front in a country at war is unpopular because he is forced to be uncompromising. Coffee was then poured. Himmler had it brought into his work area, where he renewed his official discussions. It should be noted that he neither smoked nor drank any alcohol. As the guest of honor, I was given time to drink my coffee in a leisurely manner and smoke a cigarette. Then came the big moment, when I started my long conversation with Heinrich Himmler. Based on memory, I will attempt to render our conversation as accurately as possible. Himmler's work area was decidedly modest. The room was very large, but nothing more remains in my memory than a large desk. It was off to the right rear and against the corner. A comfortable grouping of armchairs was in the opposite corner. We sat down in a relaxed manner in the chairs next to a small round table. Later on, I've often had to think about this conversation whenever it was said that one could never get close to the big men of the Third Reich. For half an hour, I sat alone with Himmler at the table, at ease and with a pistol. At that point, our informal conversation began. It is still vivid in my mind even today. After a few friendly introductory words, Himmler asked, "Oberleutnant Carius, do you believe that armor will soon be outmoded and eliminated by the development of handheld weapons?" I answered very frankly, "Reichsfuhrer, I do not share this opinion. You know that the Russians have used hunter-killer troops for a long time. They have almost never achieved anything, however, whenever our tanks were employed together and they covered each other. If infantry was also there, then it was difficult for anything to happen. The probability of a hit with bazookas and similar weapons at greater distances is very small. If the tank crews are alert, then soldiers with those weapons can definitely only shoot one time. Hunter-killer teams have had an easy time of it with the English and the Russians whenever they drove with closed hatches. Our battalion, however, has only lost a single tank to this method. That was on the Neva. It was due to the stupid employment of a single Tiger, and it was our own fault. Besides, for our anti-personnel security, we also have 6 close-in mines on the turret. When needed, they can be set off from inside, but I've never needed to make use of them." Himmler had listened attentively and then suddenly changed the topic. "What do you think about the attitude of the people back home? You've certainly had the opportunity forced upon you to gain an impression here as well." I didn't feel one bit shy about this very direct question, and I said quite openly what I thought about it. "Reichsfuhrer, there is no doubt at all that the people have become rather unnerved by the terror attacks. Everyone is waiting for a weapon that can knock this horrible enemy out of the air." I hesitated for a moment, and then continued without concern. Many people, myself included, are disgusted by the boastful speeches of certain party people who always act as if the war were already won and our final victory a given. Himmler now looked at me with great attentiveness. "In my opinion," I continued without hesitation, "our people have already shown that they are strong enough to discover the truth. They also know that we will have to continue to work hard to change the fortunes of war. Could it be arranged that experienced and decorated frontline generals occasionally come to Germany and talk to the people? These people enjoy more respect than the party people, who actually know nothing at all about the front themselves. Because of that, they only speak empty. Words probably directed from higher up. Would Himmler blow up now, I thought to myself, after I had described certain party people in such a derogatory manner? Nothing of the sort. The Reichsführer SS answered quite calmly, I am aware of the suffering of our people. I also know that the fundamental condition for our continued holding out has to be our new aerial defenses. In a relatively short time, we will be able to prevent the Americans from flying in parade formation above us. Our new jet aircraft will soon be put into operation. New flak rockets, some manned and some radio-controlled, have already been tested. A little while ago, you sat at the table with the responsible gentleman. You are correct, my dear Carius. Without wide-reaching prevention of the bombing, we will not be able to hold out much longer, but all that will look completely different shortly. At that point, Himmler hesitated for a moment. The prerequisite, to be sure, is that our fronts can be held at all costs for another year. We need this one uninterrupted year to finish the weapons that we're building to surprise the enemy. With these words, I thought about the old saying, I hear the message fine, it's just believing it that's hard. But at the same time, I glimpsed a ray of new hope. Himmler continued, Concerning your criticism of the party leadership, I also have to admit you're right, Carius. You yourself know that the best people are at the front. I simply could no longer disapprove their request to volunteer. When we win the war, and we have to win it, then we will soon remedy the abuses that prevail here right now. We will replace the incapable men with proven ones. He suddenly changed the topic again. Wouldn't you like to switch to the SS? We are looking for young and proven people. In a few weeks, you could be a Hauptsturmführer. Nothing was further from my mind than leaving my tankers. I answered promptly, No, Reichsführer. My conservative background forbids me from abandoning the flag. I only want to return to my old company. I also don't intend to go active. I think that the rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the SS up to now has only had a negative effect for everyone. Without any reservations, we in the army recognize the great achievements of the SS at the front. But you also can't forget that the SS units have the best people and the best material. That is, they have continuously received preferential treatment. That's already frequently caused bad blood with the other units. Even these remarks didn't produce a rise from Himmler. In regard to your worries about the rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the SS, I can tell you today that efforts have been underway for some time now to combine both forces. It should be noted that these efforts have continuously failed due to the stubbornness of the Wehrmacht generals. This remark by Himmler made me happy because it proved to me that our generals really did have more backbone than one usually assumed. The introduction of the German greeting or Nazi salute after July 20th had already made me extremely upset. I hoped the generals would remain resolute. The SS could join us after all, since we were certainly there first. But many things indicated that the SS wanted to swallow the Wehrmacht. Himmler was already the chief of staff of the entire replacement army, which included all elements of the Wehrmacht. In that capacity, he had just given me the oak leaves. Himmler then began to talk about personal matters. Do you have any personal wish that I can fulfill? Perhaps special leave or something similar? I immediately requested a certificate from him that my duty status would be changed to return to duty after my return. I also requested that I should be sent immediately to my unit by the replacement battalion. Himmler smiled in disapproval. That's really not going to happen, my dear Carius. I can't let you go back to the front for another 2 months. You can't finish yourself off before the end of the war. You have to recover for another couple of weeks or months in the replacement battalion. There is still enough time in the spring to return to your unit. You people at the front always want superbly trained replacements, but you never feel like training a few men yourselves. After a little give and take, I finally succeeded in receiving something in writing. In it, I was to be considered as capable of returning to duty, effective January 1st, if I so desired, and I was to be transferred immediately to my old company if I didn't want something else. I was later able to use this piece of writing quite effectively. Our conversation drew to a close. Himmler asked me whether I was acquainted with Salzburg and its vicinity. When I answered negatively, he kindly placed a car and driver at my disposal. In departure, he reached out his hand to me and said, "If you should ever have difficulties any time or anywhere, please don't hesitate to write to me. You can turn to me at any time." With that, I was dismissed in good graces. I described my visit with Heinrich Himmler in such detail because he really surprised me. After the conversation in his staff headquarters, I gathered some hope for a successful conclusion to the war. That was after I had already considered a defeat almost certain. It doesn't matter what view one has of the Third Reich, the truth requires one to describe those men as they really were. I received a vehicle from Himmler for a short joyride. The driver introduced me to the wonderful region. He drove me to Berchtesgaden to the tea house, which was commonly called the Eagle's Nest. Besides that, he also showed me the Obersalzberg mountain. I would have also enjoyed visiting my father, who was employed on the Yugoslavian border. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out his location and didn't discover until after the war that I could have easily made that detour in 3 days. That would have brought me the greatest happiness back then. During the time I lived in the special train following my award ceremony, reports that came in from the front were constantly being discussed. The commander of the 4th SS Panzer Corps, General Gila, telephoned quite frequently. His corps had been brought back up to strength and was in reserve in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, right behind the front lines. Of course, that was extremely interesting for me. We discovered that the Russians had assembled massive forces in this area with which they wanted to start their big offensive. This later ended with the capture of Berlin, thanks to the Western powers who politely waited in place to give the Russians the honors. Hitler, however, did little justice to his title as the greatest commander-in-chief. In any case, his directives back then were more than unfortunate. For instance, he pulled Panzer divisions out of the northern sector shortly before the Russian attack and moved them to the south, where we intended to initiate an offensive. According to Hitler's plan, this advance was supposed to cause the Russians to withdraw a portion of their forces to the south and thus spread themselves out. But they didn't do us the favor. The times had long since passed where Ivan was taken in by such maneuvers. Unfortunately, the Russians knew what condition we were in. In any event, the divisions were shipped to the south and ordered to attack immediately. The result was that the Russians had an easy time of it. In some cases, the infantry attacked first without the tanks. In others, just the opposite occurred. Our attack in the south was repulsed, and the divisions were, for the most part, wiped out. Contrary to all strategic and operational dictates, General Gila had to remain right behind the front. His corps was thus unable to deploy to the front after the Russian breakthrough. His units were immediately overrun during the initial Russian advance and drawn into the general confusion of the withdrawal. They were thus unable to bring their influence to bear. If the requests of Gila and other commanders had been granted to move the corps farther to the rear in reserve, then these well-equipped men could have certainly stopped the Russians. Later, their advance couldn't be stopped anymore. The advance guard of the Russian tanks had already showed up at the gates of Kustrin in January. By then, I had become acquainted with the region around Salzburg and waited for my return to the hospital. After 3 days, 2 SS officers who wanted to drive to Berlin gave me a ride. I was happy to be spared the long train trip. It was also nice that I had the opportunity to drop in on the Army Personnel Office in Berlin. I had to make do with the train afterward. On the trip from Salzburg to Berlin via Munich, I learned to appreciate the car radio, which I normally didn't care for much at all. That was because we could hear where low-flying planes were reported. Only because of that did some people escape being engaged. Whenever low-flying planes were reported, we drove under a highway bridge and waited until they had disappeared. We left our route from Munich to Berlin at the Autobahn exit in Halle and made a small detour to the Leuna synthetic oil facility. The SS officers had a meeting there with the top engineers of the plant. As far as I can remember, it concerned the moving of individual elements of the operation underground for which technical difficulties still stood in the way. This visit to the Luna facility was very interesting for me. As is well known and very understandable, the fuel production sites were always targets of the enemy's bombing raids. That shouldn't excuse the fact, however, that bombs were dropped arbitrarily and senselessly into the middle of the residential areas of the cities during the terror raids. While talking to Luna's directors, I discovered that the attacks were only expected whenever partial production resumed. If the factory was put out of commission, Then the enemy bided his time. They waited until a portion of the facility had been restored enough by the tireless women and men who worked day and night until production was again possible. They could then count on the facilities being bombed to pieces right on the evening of the first workday. Because the enemy couldn't just produce the exact times of the reconstruction work out of thin air, it was crystal clear to everyone that the traitors had to be sitting in their own factory. Despite all precautionary measures and surveillance, however, they could not be discovered. Barrage balloons floated in the air all around the factory, which stretched on, but the Americans usually flew so high that the balloons didn't help at all. The flak also had little effect. The great height of the approaching enemy formations also had its good side because the chance of a hit was much less. Unfortunately, the Americans were even informed about the effect of their raids. They continued to fly to their targets until they were successful with their bombs. Production had just started up again on the day of our visit. Because of this, the director recommended to us that we try to leave the area before the onset of darkness. Despite that, we stayed longer on our visit than we had planned. We had just reached the Autobahn when the enemy formations approached. We wanted to observe if what was said had been true. We stopped at the next overpass to see whether the Americans were once again in the know that day. It was a horrifying sight. Unfortunately, our workers were completely right. The bombers dropped their entire load on the factory, and we had the impression that this time they didn't need to fly any more missions. They had certainly done a great job. Our workers, as busy as bees, continued to partially rebuild the facilities despite everything. But that goodwill and industry couldn't help by themselves. The traitors were in the midst of them, as in other places, and the enemy could wipe out the entire tiresome labor in a few minutes. This concludes the 25th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.